April 12, 1945. Ohrdruf, Germany. 32 miles southwest of Weimar, in a pine forest that locals had been instructed, by order of the SS, never to enter. General Dwight D. Eisenhower stepped out of his staff car at 0900 hours and walked toward the gate of a compound that had, until 6 days earlier, been known officially as a labor camp. His boots crunched on frozen gravel. The morning was cold. A light fog clung to the trees. He was 60 years old, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. The man who had planned D-Day, who had coordinated the largest military operation in human history, who had stood at the edge of every great catastrophe this war had produced. Nothing had prepared him for what waited beyond that gate. I have never felt able to describe my emotional reactions when I first came face to face with indisputable evidence of Nazi brutality. He would write that evening to Army Chief of Staff George Marshall. I visited every nook and cranny of the camp because I felt it my duty to be in a position from then on to testify at first hand about these things in case there ever grew up at home the belief or assumption that the stories of Nazi brutality were just propaganda. Eisenhower walked through Ohrdruf for 2 hours. When he emerged, his face had changed. Witnesses would later struggle to describe exactly how. Not broken, not in tears. Something harder than that, something colder. General Omar Bradley, who walked beside him, said he had to stop twice to control himself. General George Patton, a man who had seen more battlefield carnage than almost any other American officer alive, walked behind a building and became physically ill. Eisenhower did not look away. He walked to every section. He read every placard the SS had left. He stopped at the piles of bodies, 3,000 of them, stacked with the indifferent geometry of lumber. And he stood there, in silence, for a long time. Then he issued an order that would become one of the most consequential commands of the entire war. Not a tactical directive, not a strategic maneuver. Something far more unusual from a supreme commander. An order about memory. He commanded that every American soldier in the vicinity, thousands of men, be brought to Ohrdruf to see what they had been fighting against. He summoned every journalist he could reach. He demanded that members of Congress and the British Parliament be flown to Germany immediately. And then he turned to the town of Ohrdruf, just beyond the tree line. The neat German town of Ohrdruf, with its church and its market and its bakeries and its 1,000 residents who had lived for years within walking distance of this place. And he issued his second order. They were coming too. Because the people of Ohrdruf had said they did not know. Eisenhower intended to make sure that claim would never be made again. The claim had already begun before the gates opened. When American soldiers from the 4th Armored Division first approached Ohrdruf on April 4th, 1945, 1 week before Eisenhower's visit, they encountered something they had not expected. Not resistance, not defiance. Incomprehension, performed incomprehension. Wir haben es nicht gewusst. We did not know. It came from the baker on Hauptstrasse, who had sold bread every morning for 3 years, from the school teacher who cycled past the forest road twice daily, from the mayor, who had signed the labor permits, from farmers whose fields bordered the compound fence, from housewives who had seen the SS trucks, from children who had heard the sounds at night that they were told by their parents were machinery. We did not know. 3 words that would become the most consequential alibi in modern history. And in April 1945, as American soldiers looked at the faces saying those words, they had to ask themselves, was it possible? Could 1,000 people living within 2 miles of a camp containing 11,700 prisoners, a camp with crematoria that ran day and night, with SS guards who drank in local taverns, with prisoner work details that marched through public roads, could they genuinely not have known? The answer, Eisenhower had already decided, did not matter. Because what was true in Ohrdruf was true across Germany. In the towns near Dachau, near Bergen-Belsen, near Buchenwald, which was built on a hill overlooking the city of Weimar, the city of Goethe, of Schiller, of Germany's greatest cultural heritage, where the smell from the crematoria had been carried by the wind into restaurant windows and schoolyards for years. We did not know. Eisenhower knew, from his experience commanding in a complex bureaucratic war, that large-scale operations cannot be hidden from the population surrounding them. Ohrdruf had required a railroad spur to be built, supplies delivered, construction workers hired from local firms, guards billeted in local homes, prisoners marched on local roads. He knew something else too, something that would drive every decision he made in the coming days. He knew that if this claim, "we did not know," was allowed to stand unchallenged, it would outlast the war. It would become the foundation of a mythology. It would be told to children, who would tell it to their children. It would metastasize into denial, and denial, left unchecked, would eventually allow someone to call the entire thing a lie. He had to destroy the alibi before it hardened. He had exactly one tool available: the truth, in its most undeniable, physical, inescapable form. And so he brought the people of Ohrdruf to see it. April 15th, 1945, 3 days after Eisenhower's visit. The morning church bells of Ohrdruf rang as they always had, at 7 o'clock. The congregation assembled as they always had, in their Sunday clothes. Children walked with their parents through the same market square where they had walked every week for their entire lives. American military police were waiting for them. The order had come directly from Eisenhower's headquarters. Every able-bodied civilian in Ohrdruf, every man, every woman, every person over the age of 16, was to be brought to the camp. They were to walk through it. They were to look at what was there. And the men, the healthy men, were to bring shovels. Captain John Lee of the 602nd Tank Destroyer Battalion supervised the assembly. He would later dictate his account to a military historian. They came out of their houses in their good clothes. That was the first thing I noticed. Several of the women had hats on, like they were going to church. Some of the older men had medals on their lapels from the First War. They looked at us, at the guards, at the trucks, and I could see them trying to calculate what this was. An inspection, maybe. Some kind of formality. They were composed, polite even. A few of the women nodded to me when they passed. That composure lasted until they got about 200 yards inside the gate. What they saw first was the smell. No one who was at Ohrdruf that morning ever found adequate words for what the smell of a concentration camp is. It is not a battlefield smell, not the iron smell of blood or the chemical smell of weapons. It is something without precedent in ordinary human experience. The soldiers who had been there for a week had stopped noticing it. The civilians of Ohrdruf, walking through that gate for the first time, had no such adaptation. Several people stopped immediately. Several vomited. One elderly man turned and tried to walk back through the gate. An MP blocked his path and pointed forward. They walked on. What they saw in the compound beyond was the same thing Eisenhower had seen 3 days earlier. The same thing that had made Patton ill and changed the expression on Eisenhower's face permanently. Bodies, thousands of them, stacked, scattered, in states of decomposition that made identification of individual human beings nearly impossible. Men who had weighed 60, 70, 80 pounds at the time of their deaths. Men whose wrists were smaller than the wrists of a child. They saw the gallows where prisoners had been hanged for attempting to escape. The wooden frames where others had been hung by their wrists. The blood-stained walls of the SS barracks. The files, meticulous German files, documenting every prisoner's entry date, work assignment, caloric allocation, and cause of death. And they saw, standing among all of this, the American soldiers watching them, not speaking, just watching. Captain Lee continued. One woman, she was maybe 50, 55, wearing a blue coat. She pointed at the bodies and she said to me in German, "We didn't know. We didn't know any of this." And I said to her through my interpreter that I found that very hard to believe. And she said again, "We didn't know." And I looked at her and I said, "You know now." The second part of Eisenhower's order was the part that caused the most controversy, and the part that decades later, those who witnessed it said they understood most completely. The men of Ohrdruf were given shovels. They were taken to the field behind the compound, a field that locals had noticed at a distance for 2 years, knowing that the ground had been turned regularly, but not, they said, knowing why. And they were directed to dig. They were digging up graves, mass graves. Sergeant Harold Hayward of the 89th Infantry Division supervised the work detail. He was 22 years old, from Columbus, Ohio. He had never been to Europe before the war. There were about 40 of them with shovels, he recalled in a 1979 interview, his voice unchanged by the 34 years between then and the memory. They dug for about 3 hours. Nobody said much. I walked up and down the line and I watched their faces. Most of them were staring at the ground, not at what they were uncovering. I understood that. You have to focus on something manageable. You focus on the dirt. But every once in a while, one of them would stop. Just stop digging and stand there. And you could see whatever they had been telling themselves, whatever the story was that had allowed them to live comfortably 2 miles from this place. It wasn't holding anymore. The bodies they unearthed were prisoners who had been shot in the final days before American arrival, as the SS attempted to destroy evidence of what had occurred. 58 bodies recovered in that initial excavation. Then more in subsequent days, as additional sites were located. Each body was documented, photographed, each grave was mapped. The men of Ohrdruf did the documentation work too, under American supervision. They carried the bodies. They placed them in rows. Some refused initially. They were not threatened. They were simply told that the work would happen and that they would do it. They did it. A woman named Helga Schubert, she was 17 years old in April 1945, the daughter of a local hardware merchant, gave testimony decades later to a German historical commission. Her account was published in 1987. I had grown up hearing the sound of the camp. We called it the factory. My father told us it was a munitions factory. We were not to ask questions about it because the SS did not permit questions. I believed my father. I was a child. I believed what I was told. When they took us inside and I saw what was there, the first thing I felt was not horror. The first thing I felt was fury at my own mind. Fury that I had been capable of believing what I had been told when everything around me, the smell, the guards, the trucks at night, the silence of the people who worked near the fence, everything had been telling me something different for years. I had chosen not to know. That is what I understood standing there. Not that I had been deceived, that I had been willing to be deceived. That is a very different thing. Before Eisenhower had ever set foot in Germany, he had anticipated this moment. Not this specific moment, not Ohrdruf, not the shovels, not the woman in the blue coat saying we didn't know. But the moment when the evidence would be questioned, when the scale of what the Nazis had done would be described to people who had not seen it and would find it, in the safety of distance and peacetime, too enormous to accept as real. He had issued the order for cameras months before anyone liberated the first camp. Every Army Signal Corps unit operating in Europe had standing orders. If you encounter evidence of German atrocities, you photograph everything, every inch. You bring in every journalist you can reach. You do not destroy or remove anything before it has been documented. The day after his visit to Ohrdruf, Eisenhower cabled Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall. The cable was 11 sentences long. 7 of those sentences concerned documentation. "I made the visit deliberately," he wrote, "in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence of these things if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda." He was not thinking about 1945. He was thinking about 1975, about 2025, about the moment, which he correctly foresaw, when the people who had stood in those camps would be dead, and their testimony would be the only thing between the truth and the lie. Margaret Bourke-White arrived at Buchenwald on April 15, 1945, the same day as the Ohrdruf Civilian March. With her Rolleiflex camera, she would later write that she forced herself to believe she was standing behind glass, separated from what she was photographing by a transparent barrier that made it documentary rather than real. It was the only way she could continue working. She worked for 6 hours. She shot 80 rolls of film. "I have to hustle," she told a colleague, "before I start to feel this. I have to get it all first." Her photographs appeared in Life magazine on May 7, 1945. The issue sold out in every city in America in a single day. People stood in lines outside newsstands. Some readers wrote letters of protest. They were disturbing, unsuitable, too graphic. Others wrote letters saying they had not fully understood until that moment what the war had been about. Eisenhower read both kinds of letters. He had expected both. What you just heard is history that most books don't tell you. Eisenhower didn't just witness the camps. He documented them, forced the world to look, and left behind a record that would outlast every attempt to deny what happened. If this story moved you, if you want to go deeper, I've put together something you won't find anywhere else. What Eisenhower saw in the camps, unpublished accounts, original documents, testimonies from the soldiers and survivors who stood there with him in April 1945. See the camps through Eisenhower's own eyes. Understand the full magnitude of what he witnessed. A story you will never find in ordinary books. The link is in the description and pinned in the first comment. Go get it. It's waiting for you. What happened in Ohrdruf was not unique. Eisenhower made sure of that. Across Germany, as other camps were liberated in the days and weeks that followed, American commanders received the same directive from Supreme Headquarters. Bring the civilians. Make them look. Document their reactions. At Buchenwald, liberated on April 11th, one day before Eisenhower's Ohrdruf visit, the local American commander took a particular interest in the city of Weimar. Weimar, the Athens of Germany. The city that had given the world Goethe, Schiller, Liszt, Nietzsche. The city that had lent its name to Germany's first democratic republic. The city that sat 7 miles from Buchenwald, 7 miles on a clear day. From a hill you could see from the city center, a hill that had been smoking from its crematoria chimneys for years. The mayor of Weimar was a man named Dr. Ernst Busenius. When American officers arrived at his office on April 12th, he expressed with elaborate courtesy his shock and horror at what he was being told. He said he had not known. Brigadier General Charles Keebler, commanding the area, informed Mayor Busenius that he and the leading citizens of Weimar would be visiting Buchenwald the following day. The mayor arrived the next morning in a suit and tie. He was accompanied by the city's cultural leaders, professors, clergy, businessmen, all in their good clothes, as the people of Ohrdruf had been. They assembled at the camp entrance and walked in. The mayor completed the tour. He was a composed man, a bureaucrat of long experience. He had governed through the entire war without visible agitation. He walked through the barracks, through the storage rooms, past the medical experimentation blocks, past the crematorium. At the gate, on the way out, he collapsed. He was carried to a bench. A doctor attended him. He recovered, physically. That evening, Mayor Ernst Busenius and his wife went home to their house in Weimar. They had dinner. They went to bed. In the morning, they were found dead. They had taken poison during the night. Whatever he had or had not known before April 13th, 1945, Dr. Ernst Busenius could not survive knowing it now. He was not the only one. Across Germany in those weeks, as liberation reached camp after camp and the compulsory tours were conducted, a small but significant number of German civilians, mayors, administrators, local officials, chose death over the reality that had been placed in front of them. Historians have debated what this means. Was it guilt? Complicity finally confronted? Or was it something more terrible? The destruction of an entire worldview, the collapse of a story about Germany and themselves that had been built over 12 years of Nazi governance and could not survive contact with what that governance had actually produced. There is no single answer. There were 1,000 different private reckonings happening simultaneously across a defeated country. Eisenhower watched all of it. Eisenhower's campaign to destroy the alibi of ignorance extended far beyond the civilians of German towns. He understood, with the strategic instinct of a man who had spent his career navigating political as well as military terrain, that there were multiple audiences for this truth. The German population was one. The American public was another. But the most important audience, the one that would determine whether the evidence survived into the future, was the world's institutional memory. On April 19, 1945, 1 week after his Ohrdruf visit, a delegation of 12 United States senators and 6 members of Congress landed in Europe. Eisenhower had personally requested their presence. He wanted elected representatives of the American people to see, with their own eyes, what had been done. Among them was Senator Alben Barkley of Kentucky, who would later become Vice President of the United States. He was 57 years old, a career politician who had been in Congress since 1913, a man who had seen most of what political life could show a person. At Buchenwald, Senator Barkley walked through the same blocks, the same storage rooms, the same crematorium that the mayor of Weimar had walked through the week before. When he came out, he sat down on a step outside the entrance and put his face in his hands. A photographer captured the image. It appeared on the front page of newspapers across America the following week. "I have seen many things in my years in public life," Barkley said in a statement afterward. "I have never seen anything that required more courage to witness than what I saw at Buchenwald. And I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am certain that the people of the United States of America must know that this happened. Every American must know." Alongside the politicians, Eisenhower had also ensured the presence of the press. 47 journalists and photographers were credentialed at the liberated camps in April 1945. Among them were Edward R. Murrow of CBS Radio, Meyer Levin of the Overseas News Agency, and Margaret Bourke-White. Together, they produced the documentary record that Eisenhower had demanded. The photographs, the broadcasts, the written testimonies that would make denial, at least for that generation, impossible. Edward R. Murrow broadcast from Buchenwald on April 15th. The broadcast lasted 11 minutes. For much of it, Murrow simply described what he saw, in the flat, precise language of a reporter who understood that editorializing would be inadequate. Then his voice broke. Not for long, he recovered. But the crack was audible to every American listening to their radio sets that evening. And the letters that poured into CBS in the following days showed that that moment, the moment when the most controlled voice in American broadcast journalism could not hold, communicated something that no amount of factual description could. This was real. This was true. This had happened. And then there were the soldiers. Eisenhower's order that every American military unit in the vicinity be brought through the camps resulted in something unprecedented in the history of warfare. A deliberate, organized exposure of combat troops to the human consequences of the enemy's ideology. These were men who had been fighting for months, men who had lost friends, men who had killed and been shot at and had learned, as soldiers must, to process violence at a manageable distance. Many of them had grown up in small American towns where the word Holocaust did not yet exist, where Europe was a faraway abstraction, where the war was understood as a conflict between nations rather than a conflict between civilization and something that had no adequate name. Private First Class Michael Gold from Brooklyn, New York, was 20 years old when he walked through Dachau on April 30th, 1945. He was Jewish, He had known, in the abstract way that American Jews in 1945 knew, that bad things were happening to Jews in Europe. He had not known the scale. He had not known Dachau. "When I walked in," he said, in an oral history recorded in 1992, "I walked in as a soldier. I walked in thinking about tactical things. Where are the guards? What's the perimeter? Is this secure? That's how they train you. You see everything through that frame. I got about 100 yards inside, and I stopped thinking tactically. I just stopped. Everything my training had given me to process the world with, it just wasn't adequate for what I was looking at. There wasn't a frame for it. I was there for 3 hours. I don't remember most of it clearly. I remember specific images. I remember a pair of shoes. Just one pair of shoes, by itself, on the ground near a barracks door. One of those ordinary things that shouldn't be strange, but was the strangest thing I'd ever seen. Because it meant there had been a person, a real person who had stood in those shoes and walked in those shoes and was now gone in a way that the shoes were not gone. I've thought about those shoes every day for 50 years. First Lieutenant William Quinn, the intelligence officer who prepared the official Army report on Dachau, submitted a document of 33 pages in May 1945. On the cover page, in the space reserved for the submitting officer's personal notation, Quinn had written 4 words outside of the official format. God forgive us all. It was not clear who he meant by us. The Germans, the Allies who had not moved faster, humanity, all of the above. The report was stamped and filed, and the 4 words were never officially acknowledged, but they remained, and they were found, and they were published, and those 4 words have been quoted by historians ever since as the most precise expression anyone produced of what it meant to stand in one of those places in April 1945. Eisenhower's campaign of documentation was, by any historical measure, extraordinarily successful. The photographs existed, the films existed, the testimonies existed, the congressional reports existed, the Army reports existed, the Nuremberg trial records existed, 42 volumes of them, containing the Nazi bureaucracy's own meticulous documentation of what it had done. And still the claim lived. Wir haben es nicht gewusst. We did not know. It lived in post-war Germany, where millions of families told their children that they had been unaware, uninvolved, bystanders to an atrocity conducted by a small group of fanatics in remote locations. It lived in the memoirs of German officers who wrote of military duty without mentioning what their armies had witnessed. It lived in the silence of the towns near the camps, where the camps themselves became, in the decades after the war, almost impossible to discuss. It lives today in different forms, on different platforms, spoken by people who were not born when any of this occurred, but who have decided, for reasons that psychologists and historians have spent decades analyzing, that the evidence assembled by Eisenhower and his photographers and his journalists and his congressional delegations is somehow insufficient. Eisenhower anticipated this too. The things I saw beggar description, he wrote in 1948 in his memoir Crusade in Europe. The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering as to leave me a bit sick. In one room, because of the stench, I could not force myself to stay long enough to take a detailed view of the many pathetic relics of humanity lying about on the floor. I made the visit deliberately. Deliberately? That word, in every account he gave, in every interview, in every piece of writing. Eisenhower never described his visit to Ohrdruf as something that had happened to him. He described it as something he had chosen. He had gone in with his eyes open because he understood, with a clarity that is difficult to fully appreciate, that his presence, his specific, documented, testified presence, was a weapon against the future. He was right about what the future would try to do. He was right that eyewitnesses would matter. He was right that the eyewitnesses would die. And he was right that what came after them would depend entirely on how well and how completely and how honestly the evidence had been preserved. The people of Ohrdruf went home on the afternoon of April 15th, 1945. They walked back through the gate, past the American military police, down the forest road, and back into the town, back to the church, the market, the bakeries, back to the houses they had lived in for their entire lives. What they carried back with them is impossible to measure with historical instruments. Some of them talked. Some of them never talked again about what they had seen. Some of them told their children nothing. Some of them told their children everything, because they had understood, standing in the compound with shovels in their hands, that the silence that had made Ohrdruf possible was itself a kind of complicity, and they were done with silence. Helga Schubert, the 17-year-old daughter of the hardware merchant, became a teacher after the war. She taught history in Thuringia for 31 years. She brought her students every year to the memorial at the former Ohrdruf camp. "I take them because I owe it," she said in her 1987 testimony. Not to the Americans, not to the Allied forces, to the people whose bodies my neighbors dug up on the 15th of April, 1945. I take my students there because those people deserve to be known. And because knowing, really knowing, standing in a place and feeling it with your body, is the only thing that has ever made any difference. She paused in the recording. We claimed we did not know. Eisenhower made us know. That is the most important thing any general did in that entire war. The German civilians of Ohrdruf claimed they did not know. Eisenhower gave them shovels and took that claim away from them. What they found in the ground is what every subsequent generation inherits. Not the graves, those have been marked and named and honored, but the question that comes with them. The question the woman in the blue coat couldn't answer, that the mayor of Weimar couldn't survive, that Private Michael Gold has been carrying for 50 years in the shape of a pair of shoes. How much do we choose not to know? How much are we capable of choosing not to know? How much of human history is the story of people standing near something terrible, hearing the trucks at night, smelling the smoke in the morning, and deciding that the story their leaders are telling them is more comfortable than the story their senses are telling them? Eisenhower didn't answer those questions. He couldn't. No one can. What he did at Ohrdruf, at Buchenwald, in the cables to Marshall, in the summons to Congress, in the orders to the signal corps and the press, was make absolutely certain that the one thing no one could ever claim again, with any credibility, was ignorance. The graves had been opened. The evidence was on the record. The witnesses had stood there, and he had made sure, with every decision he made in April 1945, that they would keep standing there, in documents, in photographs, in testimonies, in memory, long after the last person who had held a shovel in Ohrdruf was gone. The laughter, the denial, the alibi, none of it survived the shovels. Nothing does when the ground is finally opened. What Eisenhower saw in the camps. In April 1945, Eisenhower stepped into the Nazi concentration camps and witnessed horrors no human being should ever see. For the first time, unpublished accounts, original documents, and powerful testimonies from the soldiers and survivors who stood there with him. See the camps through Eisenhower's own eyes. Understand the full magnitude of what he witnessed. A story you will never find in ordinary books.